Sometimes the strongest among us carry the deepest scars. Sometimes healing comes from the most unexpected places. In 1873, Wyoming Territory, mountain trapper Rick hires a quiet woman named Maria to cook through the harsh winter. He makes it clear she's there to work, nothing more. But when his anger flares one morning and his fist hits the table, he sees dark bruises on her arm, finger-shaped bruises that tell a story of pain. In that moment, everything changes. Maria is running from a violent husband who nearly destroyed her. Rick lost his wife years ago and thought his heart was dead. As winter deepens around their isolated cabin, these two wounded souls begin to trust each other. Past comes looking for her. Both must decide what they're willing to fight for. Will love be enough to heal what seemed broken beyond repair? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The cabin sat like a weathered sentinel against the Wyoming mountains, its log walls darkened by decades of harsh winters and scorching summers. Rick Thornfield had built it with his own hands 23 years ago, when Anna was still alive and their dreams stretched as wide as the endless sky above. Now, at 52, he moved through its familiar spaces, with the careful precision of a man who had learned that routine was the only thing standing between him and the crushing weight of memory. The worn gold, band on his finger, caught the morning light as he stoked the fire. He twisted it absently, a habit that had developed over the 7 years since Anna's death. The ring had grown loose on his weathered finger, but he'd never considered removing it. It was his anchor to a time when love had filled these rooms, when laughter had echoed off the hand-hewn beams, when the future had seemed as solid as the mountains themselves. 3 weeks had passed since Maria arrived at his door, clutching a torn shawl around her shoulders like armor against the world. The fabric had once been beautiful, rich blue wool with delicate silver threading, but now it hung in tatters, frayed edges speaking of a journey that had been anything but gentle. She'd stood there in the October snow, her dark eyes holding a wariness that reminded him of injured animals he'd encountered in the wilderness. Creatures that had learned to expect pain from every human hand. "I heard in town you might need someone to cook and clean through the winter," she'd said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I can work for just room and board." Rick had studied her then, noting the way she kept her distance, how her hands trembled slightly despite her efforts to appear composed. She was perhaps 30, with the kind of beauty that sorrow had refined rather than diminished. Her dark hair was pulled back severely, and her simple brown dress, though clean, showed signs of careful mending. But it was her eyes that had decided him, not their beauty, but their desperate hope wrapped in layers of protective fear. "I don't need company," he'd said gruffly. "Just someone to cook and keep the place clean. You do your work, stay out of my way, and we'll get along fine." She'd nodded quickly, relief flooding her features. "Yes, sir. I understand." Those had been the terms, simple, clear, uncomplicated. Now 3 weeks later, Rick poured coffee from the pot she'd prepared before dawn, and marveled at how seamlessly she'd slipped into the rhythm of his solitary life. Maria moved through the cabin like morning mist, present but unobtrusive, essential but nearly invisible. She rose before him each day, had coffee ready when he emerged from his bedroom, prepared meals that were simple but perfectly seasoned, and maintained the cabin with a thoroughness that spoke of both skill and desperate gratitude. She never spoke unless spoken to, never lingered in a room when he entered, never met his eyes for more than a fleeting moment. It should have been exactly what he wanted, efficient domestic help without the complication of human connection. Instead, her careful distance had begun to unsettle him in ways he couldn't quite name. Rick remembered Anna's presence in this same space, how she'd hummed while cooking, how she'd tell him stories of her day while he whittled by the fire, how her laughter had made even the harshest winter evenings feel warm. Anna had filled every corner of their life together with light and sound and joy. Maria, by contrast, seemed to fold herself smaller each day, as if she was trying to disappear entirely. He'd caught glimpses of who she might have been, fleeting moments when she thought herself unobserved. Yesterday, he'd seen her gently stroking an injured sparrow she'd found near the woodpile, her voice soft and soothing as she'd tended its wing before releasing it. Last week, he'd heard her humming, just for a moment, while she'd kneaded bread. But the sound had stopped abruptly when his footsteps had creaked on the floorboards above. The morning routine had become as predictable as sunrise. Rick would emerge from his bedroom to find coffee waiting and Maria already busy with some task, mending clothes, preparing food, or quietly sweeping. She'd nod respectfully, he'd grunt his acknowledgement, and they'd move through their separate spheres until evening brought them together at the rough wooden table he'd built for Anna. Even their shared meals were exercises in careful distance. Maria served his food and ate her own portion in silence, responding to his occasional questions with polite brevity. She was an excellent cook, better than he'd expected, with a subtle way with herbs that made even simple fare taste remarkable. But she ate like someone who'd learned not to expect regular meals, quickly and efficiently, as if the food might disappear if she didn't consume it fast enough. The evenings were the hardest part. Rick would sit by the fire, whittling or reading one of his few books, while Maria quietly tended to household tasks. The silence stretched between them like a frozen lake, vast and treacherous. Sometimes he'd catch her looking at the flames with an expression of such profound sadness that it made his chest tight. Other times he'd notice how she jumped at sudden sounds, the settling of logs in the fire, wind rattling the windows, even his own movements when they were too quick or forceful. She slept in Anna's sewing room, which Rick had hastily converted with a simple bed and washstand. He'd offered her the spare bedroom, but she'd insisted the smaller room was more than adequate. "I don't need much space," she'd said, and something in her tone had suggested she was accustomed to making do with very little. The torn shawl hung on a peg by her door. She mended it a little each evening, though Rick could see it would never be the same. Like its owner, it bore the marks of whatever rough handling had brought her to his mountain refuge. He'd wanted to ask about her journey, about the circumstances that had driven a woman to seek shelter with a stranger in the wilderness. But something in her careful composure warned him away from such questions. Rick understood the need for silence about painful things. His own grief had taught him that some wounds were too deep for words, that healing sometimes required the luxury of being left alone with one's thoughts. So he respected her boundaries, even as curiosity gnawed at him. Still, he found himself noticing things. The way she favored her left side slightly, as if protecting old injuries. The careful way she moved around him, always maintaining distance, always keeping furniture or space between them. The fact that she never fully relaxed, even when she thought herself unobserved. And those bruises he'd glimpsed on her wrists, faded yellow-green marks that suggested recent healing. This morning felt different, though Rick couldn't say why. Maybe it was the heavy snow that had fallen overnight, sealing them more completely into their mountain isolation. Maybe it was the way Maria had seemed even quieter than usual, her movements carrying an extra weight of caution. Or maybe it was simply that 3 weeks of careful coexistence had brought them to some invisible threshold that neither had. Acknowledged, Rick finished his coffee and prepared for his daily routine of checking traps and gathering firewood. Winter was closing its grip on the mountains, and soon they'd be truly snowed in until spring. The thought brought both comfort and unease. Comfort because it meant absolute solitude, the kind of deep quiet that had become his refuge. Unease because it meant months of careful navigation around Maria's skittish presence, months of pretending not to notice the sadness that seemed to radiate from her like heat from banked coals. As he reached for his coat, he glanced toward the kitchen where Maria was already preparing the midday meal. The morning light caught the silver threads in her torn shawl, and for just a moment he could imagine what it had looked like when new, what she had looked like before whatever storm had driven her to his door. The thought brought an unexpected tightness to his chest, a feeling he quickly pushed aside. He had no room in his life for such considerations. Anna's memory filled all the emotional space he had to spare, and this arrangement with Maria was purely practical. She needed shelter, he needed domestic help. Nothing more, but as he stepped out into the pristine snow, Rick found himself hoping that whatever had put that haunted look in Maria's eyes was far behind them both, buried as deeply as Anna's grave in the valley below. The morning began like any other, with Maria moving quietly through her established routine, while Rick prepared for another day of winter preparations. But tension had been building in him like pressure behind a dam, small frustrations accumulating into something larger and more volatile than he cared to acknowledge. It started with the coffee pot. The handle, weakened by years of use, finally gave way as he lifted it, sending hot coffee splashing across the wooden table and onto the floor. Rick cursed under his breath, more annoyed at himself than at the broken implement, but the minor disaster seemed to unlock something that had been coiled tight in his chest for days. "Damn thing," he muttered. Setting the damaged pot down harder than necessary, Maria appeared instantly with rags to clean the spill, moving with the quick efficiency of someone accustomed to managing small crises. But her very competence irritated him further, the way she anticipated problems, the way she seemed to expect disasters, the way she moved around him like he was something dangerous that might explode without warning. "Leave it," he said, more sharply than he intended. She froze mid-motion, the cleaning rag suspended in her hand. "I can clean it quickly, sir. It's no trouble." I said, "Leave it." The words came out harder than he meant, loaded with frustrations that had nothing to do with spilled coffee and everything to do with the careful distance she maintained, the way she made him feel like a stranger in his own home. Maria straightened slowly, the rag clutched in her white-knuckled grip. In the morning light streaming through the window, Rick could see the fine tension lines around her eyes, the way her shoulders had drawn up almost to her ears. She was preparing for something, bracing herself in a way that spoke of long experience with masculine anger. That realization should have cooled his temper. Instead, it stoked it higher. 3 weeks of walking on eggshells around her skittish presence. 3 weeks of feeling like an intruder in his own cabin. 3 weeks of careful politeness that felt more suffocating than the deepest winter snow. It all came rushing up at once. "What exactly are you afraid I'm going to do?" The question burst out of him, rough and accusatory. "You jump every time I move. You act like I'm some kind of wild animal." He slammed his fist down on the table for emphasis. The sharp crack of flesh-meeting wood echoing through the cabin like a gunshot. The effect on Maria was instantaneous and devastating. She dropped the rag and stumbled backward, her arms coming up defensively in front of her face. The movement pulled her sleeve up her forearm, and in that frozen moment, Rick saw them clearly. For the first time, dark bruises wrapped around her wrist and extending up her arm like the shadow of cruel fingers. The sight hit him like a physical blow. The bruises were in various stages of healing, some yellow-green and fading, others still deep purple and obviously recent, but their pattern was unmistakable. Someone had grabbed her, hard and repeatedly. Someone had hurt her badly enough to leave marks that lingered for weeks. All the anger drained out of him as if a stopper had been pulled. His fist was still pressed against the table, but now the gesture seemed monstrous rather than merely frustrated. He was a large man, 6 feet tall, with shoulders broadened by years of physical labor. His hands were scarred and calloused from decades of outdoor work. To Maria, crouched there with her arms raised protectively, he must look exactly like whoever had given her those bruises. "Maria." His voice came out as a whisper, all the roughness gone. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean I wouldn't hurt you." She was crying now, silent tears streaming down her cheeks as she slowly lowered her arms. The sleeve had fallen back down, but the image of those bruises was seared into his memory. He could see now why she moved so carefully, why she kept her distance, why his every gesture seemed to frighten her. "I know," she whispered, but her voice shook with uncertainty. "I know you wouldn't." When men get angry, She couldn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to. Rick understood with horrible clarity what her silence had been protecting, not just her own dignity, but him from the knowledge of what someone had done to her. "Who did this to you?" The question came out low and dangerous, but not directed at her. He was thinking of whoever had left those marks, whoever had taught her to expect violence from masculine anger. Maria's hands fluttered to her sleeves, pulling them down to cover her wrists. "It doesn't matter now. He can't. I'm safe here." But even as she said it, Rick could see she didn't entirely believe it. How could she? If someone had hurt her badly enough to leave those kinds of marks, they'd probably threatened worse. And if she'd run from it, they were probably looking for her. "Your husband?" he asked gently. She nodded, fresh tears spilling over. When he gets angry, She stopped, wrapping her arms around herself protectively. "I tried to be good, to do everything right, but it was never enough. Nothing was ever enough." Rick felt something cold and hard settle in his chest. He'd seen men who hit women before, cowards who used their strength to terrorize those smaller and weaker, but he'd never had to look at the aftermath up close, never had to see the way. It lingered in a woman's every movement, every reaction, every careful breath. "How long?" he asked. 3 years of marriage, but it got worse after—" She stopped again, her hand moving unconsciously to her stomach. Something flickered across her face, a deeper pain that made the bruises seem almost secondary. "After I couldn't give him what he wanted." Rick's jaw tightened. He could imagine what that meant, and the thought made his hands curl into fists, but he kept them pressed flat against the table, acutely aware now of how his every movement affected her. "Where is he now?" "I don't know. I left while he was gone on business. I took what little money I'd saved and just ran. I thought maybe if I could get far enough away, find somewhere remote." She looked around the cabin with something like wonder. "This is the first place I've felt safe in years." The admission broke something loose in Rick's chest. This rough cabin, this isolated mountain refuge he'd built as a sanctuary for his grief, had become her sanctuary too. She'd found in his solitude the same thing he'd been seeking, a place where the past couldn't quite reach. "He won't find you here," Rick said, and meant it. "This place, I built it to be hidden. Most folks don't even know it exists." Maria looked at him with something like hope flickering in her dark eyes. You won't send me away?" The question hit him like another physical blow. Send her away, back to whatever hell she'd escaped from. The idea was unthinkable. "No," he said firmly. "You're safe here, for as long as you need." She sagged with relief, her careful composure finally cracking completely. The tears came harder. Now, but they seemed different. Not the quick, fearful tears of someone expecting punishment, but the deeper release of someone who'd been holding terror at bay for too long. Rick wanted to comfort her, but he didn't know how. Physical comfort seemed impossible, given what he'd just learned. Words felt inadequate. So he did the only thing that occurred to him. He got up slowly, moving with deliberate care, and went to the stove where the wooden spoon she used for cooking lay beside the pot. The spoon was split down the middle from where he'd gripped it too hard during some forgotten moment of frustration. He'd been meaning to replace it, but had never gotten around to it. Now it seemed like a perfect symbol of his own capacity for destruction, something useful and necessary, broken by careless force. He picked up the damaged spoon and held it out to her. "I broke this a few days ago, grabbed it too hard when I was annoyed about something stupid, just like I slammed my fist down just now." He met her eyes directly. "I'm not angry at you, Maria. I'm angry at whoever made you afraid. But I understand now why my anger frightens you, and I'll be more careful." She looked at the broken spoon, then at his face. Something shifted in her expression, a cautious recognition of sincerity. "It's still useful," she said quietly, taking the spoon from his hand. Their fingers brushed briefly, and she didn't pull away. Broken things can still have purpose. "Yes," Rick agreed, though he suspected they were talking about more than kitchen implements. "They can." The storm outside chose that moment to intensify, wind howling around the cabin and rattling the windows. But inside, something had changed. The careful distance that had defined their coexistence for 3 weeks had collapsed, replaced by something more honest and infinitely more fragile. Rick settled back into his chair, moving slowly and keeping his hands visible on the table. Maria remained standing for a moment, clutching the broken spoon, then gradually lowered herself back into her own seat across from him. "Thank you," she said simply. "For what? For not making me leave. For—" she gestured vaguely at the space between them. "For understanding." Rick nodded, acutely aware that understanding was just the beginning. Outside, the storm raged on, sealing them into their mountain sanctuary. But inside, 2 damaged people had taken their first tentative step toward something that might, eventually, become trust. The days that followed their difficult conversation moved with a different rhythm, like a river that had changed course around some new obstacle. Rick found himself hyper-aware of his movements, conscious of the space he occupied and the sounds he made in ways he'd never had to consider before. Maria, for her part, seemed to breathe a little easier, though she still moved through the cabin with careful grace. It was on the 4th evening after their revelation that Rick made a decision that surprised even himself. He'd been sitting by the fire, whittling a piece of pine, while Maria quietly mended clothes nearby, when he stood and walked to the old wooden chest in the corner of the room. Inside, wrapped in soft cloth, lay his father's hand-carved chess set. The pieces were beautiful in their simplicity, carved from 2 different woods, light maple and dark walnut, worn smooth by decades of handling. His father had made them during the long winter of 1834, trapped in a lime cabin with nothing but time and a sharp knife. Rick had learned to play on this set as a boy, and later he'd taught Anna, though she'd never developed much skill or interest in the game. "Do you know how to play chess?" he asked, setting the board on the small table between their chairs. Maria looked up from her sewing, surprise flickering across her features. It was perhaps the first time he'd initiated conversation that wasn't strictly necessary for their daily routine. "My father taught me when I was young," she said carefully. "Though it's been years since I've played." Rick began setting up the pieces, his weathered hands gentle with the carved figures. "My father made these. Said a man needed something to occupy his mind during the long winters. Something that required more thought than just surviving." Maria set down her mending and leaned forward slightly, examining the carved pieces with genuine interest. "They're beautiful. Your father was skilled. He was a patient man. Had to be, to carve all 32 pieces with nothing but a pocket knife." Rick positioned the final pawn and looked up at her. "Would you like to play?" The question hung in the air between them, carrying more weight than a simple game invitation. It was an offering of time spent together by choice rather than necessity, an acknowledgement that they might be more than just 2 people sharing the same space. Maria hesitated, her fingers smoothing the fabric in her lap. "I'm probably very rusty. That makes 2 of us. I haven't played since—" He stopped, the automatic reference to Anna dying on his lips. "In quite some time," she nodded, and moved to sit across from him at the small table. The firelight danced across the carved pieces, making them seem almost alive in the flickering glow. "White moves first," Rick said, gesturing to her side of the board. Maria studied the board for a long moment before moving her king's pawn forward 2 squares. It was a solid, traditional opening, and Rick found himself genuinely curious about how she'd play. He responded with his own pawn move, and the game began. They played in comfortable silence at first, each move considered carefully. Rick had expected her to play cautiously, defensively, but Maria's style surprised him. She was indeed rusty, missing some tactical opportunities, and making a few positional errors, but there was an underlying boldness to her play that spoke of someone who had once been confident in taking calculated risks. "Your father taught you well," Rick observed as she executed a clever knight maneuver that he hadn't anticipated. "He said chess was like life," Maria replied, her eyes still focused on the board. "You have to think several moves ahead, but you also have to be ready to adapt when circumstances change." She paused, her hand hovering over a bishop. He said the most dangerous opponent was someone who appeared weak, but was really just being patient. Rick studied her face in the firelight, wondering if she was talking about chess or something else entirely. There was a subtle strength in her that he was only beginning to recognize. The kind of resilience it took to survive what she'd survived and still have the courage to trust again. Even tentatively, "What did your father do?" he asked as she completed her move. He was a school teacher in Kansas. Came west after the war to help establish schools in the new settlements. A smile flickered across her face, the first genuine smile Rick had seen from her. He used to say that education was the one thing no one could take away from you once you had it. Wise man. Yes. He died when I was 18. Pneumonia. The smile faded. That's when circumstances became difficult. Rick could read between the lines. A young woman left alone, probably with few options, forced to make choices that had led her eventually to a marriage that became a prison. He wanted to ask more, but something in her posture warned him not to push. Instead, he moved his queen to a more aggressive position and said, "He sounds like the kind of man who'd be proud of his daughter's courage." Maria's hand stilled on her captured pawn. She looked up at him with startled eyes. "Courage? It takes courage to leave everything you know, even when staying means getting hurt. It takes courage to trust a stranger in the wilderness. It takes courage to play chess with someone you barely know." He gestured at the board between them. Most people would call all of that courage. She was quiet for a long time, her fingers tracing the smooth wood of the captured pawn. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I don't feel courageous. I feel like a coward who ran away. Running towards safety isn't cowardice," Rick said firmly. "It's survival, and survival takes its own kind of strength." The fire crackled and shifted, sending new patterns of light across their faces. Maria made her next move, then looked directly at him for the first time since they'd begun playing. "What about you? What would your father think of you hiding away up here?" The question caught Rick off guard. He'd been so focused on drawing her out that he hadn't expected her to turn the conversation back on him. But her tone wasn't challenging, it was genuinely curious, with an undertone of concern that suggested she'd been thinking about his isolation as much as her own circumstances. "I don't know," he admitted. "He died before I got married, before Anna. He never saw me truly happy, so I suppose he never saw me truly lost either." "Anna was your wife?" "Yes, she died 7 years ago. Fever took her one winter when I couldn't get her to town fast enough." The words came easier than he'd expected. "I built this place for us, but after she died, it became a refuge," Maria finished softly. "Yes." They resumed playing, but the conversation had opened something between them. Rick found himself talking about things he hadn't discussed in years. Anna's laugh, her terrible cooking before she learned to manage the wood stove, her dreams of having children to fill their mountain home with life and noise. Maria listened with the kind of attention that made him feel heard rather than merely tolerated. She asked thoughtful questions, offered gentle observations, and gradually began sharing her own memories, her father's books, the small schoolhouse where she'd first learned to love learning, the garden she'd tended as a girl by the time she checkmated him with a move he hadn't seen coming. The fire had burned low, and the evening had grown late. Rick stared at the board for a moment, genuinely surprised by his defeat. "I told you my father taught me well," Maria said with a small, "Please smile." Indeed he did. Rick began gathering the pieces, noting how the evening had transformed her. The rigid tension in her shoulders had eased, and her voice had lost some of its careful modulation. For a few hours she'd seemed less like a frightened refugee and more like the woman she might have been under different circumstances. Would you like to play again tomorrow evening?" she asked hesitantly. "I'd enjoy that," Rick replied, and meant it. As they prepared for bed, Rick found himself thinking about his father's chess set with new appreciation. The old man had been right. A person did need something to occupy the mind during long winters. But Rick was beginning to suspect that what he'd really needed wasn't just mental stimulation, but human connection. The kind of genuine conversation that made the walls of the cabin feel less like a prison and more like a home. That night, as snow continued to fall outside and seal them further into their mountain sanctuary, both of them slept more peacefully than they had in weeks. The leather-bound recipe book lay forgotten on the high shelf above the kitchen basin, gathering dust like so many other remnants of Anna's presence. Rick had placed it there in the months following her death, unable to bear the sight of her careful handwriting, yet unwilling to destroy something so intimately hers. For 7 years, it had remained untouched, a silent monument to meals shared and love expressed through the simple act of nourishment. It was Maria who found it, reaching for a jar of preserved peaches on a gray December morning when the snow lay 3 feet deep outside the cabin windows. Her fingers brushed against the worn leather binding, and she drew it down with careful curiosity. "Oh," she breathed, opening the cover to reveal the first page, Anna Thornfield's Kitchen Wisdom, 1861-1866, written in a flowing script that spoke of careful education and feminine grace. Rick looked up from his coffee to see Maria cradling the book with something approaching reverence. The sight hit him like a physical blow. This woman who had fled from violence, holding the cherished memories of the woman he had loved most in the world. "I'm sorry," Maria said quickly, seeing his expression. "I didn't mean to pry. I was just reaching for—" "It's all right." The words came out rougher than he intended, thick with unexpected emotion. He cleared his throat and tried again. Those were Anna's recipes. She loved to cook. Maria's thumb traced the edge of the worn pages. "May I look at them?" "I promise I'll be careful." Rick found himself nodding, though his chest felt tight. She would have liked that. Anna always said recipes were meant to be shared, not hoarded. Maria settled at the kitchen table, turning the pages with the delicate attention of someone who understood the value of preserved memories. Rick moved to stand behind her, close enough to see the familiar handwriting that had once filled his world with small, daily love notes. "Honey wheat bread, Papa's favorite," read one entry in Anna's careful script. "Remember to sing while kneading, makes the dough lighter and the work more joyful. Venison stew for cold nights, add extra carrots." Rick pretends not to like them, but always asks for seconds. "Apple butter, use the Macintosh from the old tree by the creek." Rick carved our initials in that bark the day he proposed. Each recipe was more than instructions. They were small stories, intimate observations about the life Anna had built in this cabin. Rick felt the familiar ache of loss, but for the first time in years, it was accompanied by something else, a bittersweet pleasure in remembering the details of their shared happiness. "She sounds wonderful," Maria said softly, pausing at a recipe for Christmas pudding that included the note, "Make double batch. Rick's sweet tooth rivals any child's." She was. Rick pulled out the chair beside her, settling close enough to share the book. Anna could make a feast from practically nothing. During our first winter here, we ran low on supplies, and she kept us fed on what seemed like creative miracles. Maria turned to a page titled Healing Remedies, where Anna had recorded various herbal preparations alongside her food recipes. Willow bark tea for Rick's shoulder aches after long days chopping wood. Chamomile and honey for sleepless nights missing home. "Your shoulder still bothers you," Maria observed, glancing at the way Rick unconsciously favored his left side. "I noticed you favoring it when you bring in firewood." Rick was surprised by her attention to detail, though he supposed survival had taught her to notice such things. "Old injury from the war. Gets worse in cold weather." Maria was quiet for a moment, studying the faded writing. Anna wrote about using willow bark and arnica. "I know something about herbal remedies too. My mother taught me before she died, and I learned more from the women in—" She stopped, her expression closing off slightly. "From other women over the years. You could try Anna's remedy if you want," Rick found himself saying. "The willow trees grow down by the stream, though it's frozen now." "Come spring, I have some willow bark already," Maria interrupted gently. "I gathered herbs before winter set in, stored them in my room. I could make Anna's preparation if you'd like." The offer hung between them, laden with implications neither quite voiced. It would mean Maria taking an active role in his care rather than simply maintaining the cabin. It would mean touching him, tending to him, crossing the careful boundaries they'd established. But looking at Anna's recipe book, at her careful notations about caring for his old war wound, Rick felt something shift in his chest. Anna had tended this same injury with loving hands. She'd wanted him comfortable and pain-free. Somehow the idea of Maria following Anna's own remedies felt less like betrayal and more like continuation. "I'd appreciate that," he said simply. That evening, after their chess game, which Maria won again, to Rick's growing respect for her strategic mind, she retrieved a small bundle of dried herbs from her room. Rick watched as she prepared the willow bark tea exactly as Anna's recipe described, her movements economical and sure. "Where did you learn so much about healing?" he asked as she strained the bitter-smelling brew. "My mother was known in our town for her herb knowledge. People came to her when the doctor was too far or too expensive." Maria's voice held a note of pride that Rick hadn't heard before. "She said God put everything we needed in the natural world. We just had to learn to see it." What happened to her? "Consumption when I was 16. After that, people still came to me for help, but," she gestured at herself with a rueful smile. A young, unmarried woman practicing healing arts made some folks nervous. It became complicated. Rick was beginning to understand the narrowing circumstances that had led to her marriage. A young woman alone, with knowledge that made some people suspicious, in need of protection and respectability. It would have made her vulnerable to a man who promised security, but delivered control instead. "Drink this while it's hot," she said, handing him the steaming cup. "It tastes awful, but Anna's notes say it works." The tea was indeed bitter, but Rick drank it without complaint. As he did, Maria moved behind his chair with careful steps. "May I?" she asked, her hands hovering near his shoulders. Rick nodded, tensing slightly as her gentle fingers found the knots of pain that had plagued him for 20 years. Her touch was professional at first, locating the sources of tension with practiced skill. But as she worked, her movements became more personal, more attuned to his specific needs. "You carry a lot of tension here," she murmured, her thumbs working at a particularly stubborn knot. "This injury, it wasn't just physical damage, was it?" Rick was surprised by her insight. "Shrapnel from a cannonball. But you're right. I think I've been bracing against the pain for so long. My whole body learned to guard against it. Pain has a way of changing how we move through the world," Maria said quietly, and Rick suspected she wasn't just talking about physical injuries. "Sometimes we protect hurts so carefully that we forget how to let healing happen." Her hands stilled on his shoulders for a moment, and Rick found himself acutely aware of her warmth, her gentle strength, the subtle scent of herbs that clung to her hair and clothes. For the first time in years, another person was caring for his physical needs with something approaching tenderness. "Better?" she asked, stepping back. Rick rolled his shoulders experimentally, genuinely amazed at the difference. "Much better. Thank you." As they prepared for bed, Rick found himself removing his wedding ring for the first time since Anna's death. Not to put it away, he wasn't ready for that, but to really look at it, to clean the tarnish that had accumulated over 7 years of faithful wearing. The ring had grown loose on his finger, he realized. His hands had aged, growing more weathered and scarred, changing as he'd changed. But the ring remained the same, a symbol of love that had been perfect and complete in its time, but which perhaps didn't need to define every moment that followed. As he cleaned the gold band, Rick thought about Anna's recipe book, lying open on the kitchen table, her words about sharing rather than hoarding, her careful attention to his needs and comfort. Maria had followed Anna's recipes with the same loving attention to detail that Anna herself had shown. It felt less like replacement and more like honoring, a way of keeping Anna's caring spirit alive in the world. That night, Rick slept more deeply than he had in months, his shoulder free from its familiar ache. In the room down the hall, Maria lay awake a little longer, thinking about the unexpected intimacy of caring for someone who accepted her touch without fear or demand. Someone who received her knowledge as gift rather than threat. The blizzard outside raged on, but inside the cabin, two healing souls had taken another small step toward trust. The silver locket had been Maria's most carefully guarded secret, hidden in the deepest corner of her traveling bag, beneath layers of carefully folded clothing. For 3 years, she had carried it like a talisman of grief, touching it in moments of deepest despair to remember what love felt like before it became twisted into something cruel and possessive. It was a simple piece, tarnished silver with delicate etching around the edges, no larger than a silver dollar. Inside, pressed behind a piece of thin glass, was a single photograph, a baby's face, perfect and peaceful, with Maria's dark eyes and delicate features. The child who had lived for only 3 hours, who had drawn just enough breath to cry once before slipping away into whatever realm holds souls too pure for this harsh world. The locket fell from her trembling fingers during a moment of careless distraction. Maria had been reaching for her spare shawl, her mind occupied with the evening's chess game and Rick's gentle laughter at something she'd said about her father's teaching methods, when her hand caught the edge of her bag. The locket tumbled out, striking the wooden floor with a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the quiet cabin. Rick, who had been banking the fire for the night, turned at the sound. Maria dove for the locket with desperate urgency, but Rick's reflexes, honed by years of mountain living, were quicker. His hand closed around the small silver piece before she could reach it. "Please," Maria whispered, her voice breaking on the single word. "Please give it back." But Rick had already seen it, the way the firelight caught the silver surface, the way her entire body had gone rigid with panic. This wasn't just jewelry. This was something that mattered more than her own safety. He could see it in her eyes, in the way her hands shook as she reached toward him. "I'm sorry," he said gently, offering the locket back without opening it. "I didn't mean to intrude." Maria clutched the silver piece against her chest, her shoulders shaking with suppressed sobs. But instead of fleeing to her room as Rick expected, she remained frozen there, staring at him with an expression of such raw vulnerability that it took his breath away. "She would have been 3 years old now," Maria whispered, so quietly Rick had to strain to hear her. Her name was going to be Isabella. Isabella Rose. The words hung in the air between them like prayer and confession combined. Rick felt his heart clench with sudden understanding. The careful way she moved through the world, the desperate gratitude for safety, the bone-deep sadness that seemed to emanate from her even in moments of contentment. It wasn't just about escaping an abusive husband. It was about losing a child. Would you show me?" Rick asked, his voice gentle as falling snow. Maria's fingers trembled as she opened the locket, revealing the tiny photograph inside. Even in the flickering firelight, Rick could see the perfect features, the peaceful expression of a baby who had never known anything but love in her brief existence. "She was born too early," Maria said, tears streaming freely now. 3 months too early. I held her for 3 hours, and she was so small, so perfect. She tried to breathe, but her lungs..." Her voice broke completely. Rick felt his own eyes burn with unexpected tears. He thought of all the children he and Anna had hoped for, all the empty rooms in their cabin that were meant to echo with young voices. But at least his loss had been theoretical, a dream that never materialized. Maria had held her daughter, had counted tiny fingers and toes, had watched life slip away in her arms. What happened after? He asked, though he suspected the answer would be painful. "Thomas, my husband, he blamed me, said I must have done something wrong, been too active, too careless. The doctor said it wasn't anyone's fault, that sometimes these things just happen. But Thomas..." She closed the locket with shaking fingers. "He said I was cursed, that God was punishing me for something. He said I'd probably never carry a healthy child, that I was broken." The cruelty of it hit Rick like a physical blow. A woman losing her first child should have been comforted, supported, loved through her grief. Instead, Maria had been blamed and shamed, her loss twisted into evidence of her supposed inadequacy. He was wrong, Rick said fiercely. About all of it. You're not cursed. You're not broken. Sometimes terrible things happen that aren't anyone's fault. After Isabella died, everything changed. Thomas became angry all the time, said I'd failed as a wife, that I owed him a son to carry on his name. When I couldn't get pregnant again right away, he started. She touched her wrist unconsciously, where the faded bruises had finally disappeared. He said he was trying to make me stronger, to fix whatever was wrong with me. Rick's hands clenched into fists, but he kept them carefully out of Maria's sight. The picture of her marriage was becoming horrifyingly clear. A grieving mother, blamed for her loss, systematically broken down by a man who should have been her partner in sorrow. Anna and I, we wanted children too, Rick found himself saying. Tried for years, but it never happened. Anna used to blame herself, wondered what she was doing wrong. I told her it wasn't anyone's fault, that sometimes life just doesn't give us what we want most. Maria looked at him with something like surprise. You never had children? No, Anna died thinking she'd failed me as a wife because she couldn't give me sons. Rick's voice grew rough with old pain. I would have given up every child that never was, just to have one more day with her. That's what love is. It's not about what someone can give you, it's about wanting them safe and happy regardless. The words seemed to hit Maria like a revelation. She stared at him with wide eyes, as if the concept of unconditional love was foreign to her experience. Thomas used to say that love had to be earned, she whispered. That I had to prove I deserved his affection. That's not love, Rick said firmly. That's ownership. Love is... He struggled for words, thinking of Anna's face, her laughter, the way she'd cared for him through his darkest moments. Love is wanting to take care of someone even when they can't do anything for you in return. Love is what you had for Isabella in those 3 hours, pure and complete, and asking for nothing back. Maria's face crumpled, and Rick found himself moving toward her without conscious thought. When his arms came around her, she didn't pull away. Instead, she collapsed against his chest, sobbing with the raw grief of someone who had never been allowed to properly mourn. Rick held her carefully, acutely aware of how small she felt against him, how her whole body shook with years of suppressed pain. Her tears soaked through his shirt, and he found himself crying too, for Isabella Rose, who never got to grow up, for Maria's stolen motherhood, for Anna's empty womb, for all the children who existed only in the dreams of those who loved them. She was beautiful, Rick murmured against Maria's hair. You're Isabella. She was loved, and that matters. That's what stays. They held each other by the dying fire, two people who had lost different versions of the same dream, finding in shared grief a communion deeper than words. Outside, the wind howled around the cabin, but inside, something profound and healing was taking place. When Maria's sobs finally quieted, she remained in Rick's arms, neither of them ready to break the spell of comfort they'd found. Her small hand rested over his heart, and Rick could feel the silver locket pressed between them, a tangible reminder of love that transcended loss. Thank you, she whispered against his chest. For understanding, for not telling me I should be over it by now. Grief doesn't follow anyone else's timeline, Rick replied. Anna's been gone 7 years, and some days I still expect to hear her humming in the kitchen. Maria pulled back slightly to look at his face. Do you think it's possible to love someone new without betraying the memory of someone you've lost? The question hung between them, loaded with implications that both recognized but neither quite dared to name. Rick looked down at her tear-stained face, at the hope and fear warring in her dark eyes, and felt his heart make a decision his mind wasn't quite ready to acknowledge. I think the people we've loved would want us to be happy, he said carefully. I think Anna would want me to take care of someone who needed caring for. I think Isabella would want her mother to find peace. Maria's hand moved to touch his cheek, her palm warm against his weathered skin. I think you might be right. They stayed like that for a long moment, on the threshold of something that would change everything between them. Then Maria stepped back, clutching her locket, and Rick let her go, though his arms felt empty without her. Good night, Rick, she said softly. Good night. Maria, as she disappeared into her room, Rick remained by the fire, staring at the glowing embers and thinking about silver lockets, about love that survived death, about the courage it took to open a wounded heart to the possibility of healing. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new conversations, new steps forward. But tonight, two grieving souls had found in each other's pain a recognition of shared humanity that transcended their careful boundaries. The storm outside was finally beginning to quiet, but inside Rick's chest, something new was stirring to life. The small wooden robin fit perfectly in Maria's palm, its smooth curves worn soft by Rick's patient whittling. He had worked on it during the long evenings, while she read aloud from one of his few books, his weathered hands shaping the pine with the same gentle precision he brought to everything he touched. When he'd finished, he'd held it out to her with an expression somewhere between pride and uncertainty. "I'm not much of an artist," he'd said, almost apologetically. "But I thought, you mentioned once that your mother loved robins." Said they were the first sign of spring's promise. Maria had taken the carved bird with hands that trembled slightly, not from fear this time, but from the overwhelming realization that someone had been listening to her small revelations, collecting her casual memories and turning them into something tangible and beautiful. The robin was no larger than her thumb, but every detail was perfectly rendered. The tilt of its head, the texture suggested in its feathers, even the tiny beak carved with delicate precision. "It's beautiful," she'd whispered, and for the first time since arriving at the mountain cabin, her smile had been completely unguarded. "Rick, it's perfect." The joy in her voice had lit something in Rick's chest that he'd thought was dead forever. When was the last time he'd created something purely for the pleasure of giving it to another person? When had he last felt the satisfaction of work done not from necessity, but from affection? The small robin represented the first creative act he'd attempted since Anna's death, the first time his hands had shaped something beautiful rather than merely functional. Now, 3 days later, Maria carried the robin with her everywhere. Rick would catch glimpses of her touching it like a talisman, while she kneaded bread, while she mended clothing, while she sat by the fire in the evenings. The simple gesture never failed to warm him, evidence that his gift had found a place in her carefully guarded heart. "Tell me about your mother's garden," Rick said one evening as they sat by the fire, Maria's fingers absently stroking the smooth wood of the carved robin. "You mentioned she grew herbs, but what else?" Maria's face softened with memory. "Flowers, mostly. She said a garden without beauty was just farming. She had roses that climbed the side of our house, pink ones that smelled like heaven in June, and delphiniums that grew taller than me, deep blue like evening sky. But her favorites were the robins that nested in the old apple tree." She held up the carved bird, turning it in the firelight. She used to say robins were messengers of hope, that their song promised winter couldn't last forever. Every spring, she'd watch for the first one, and when she spotted it, she'd make a wish. What did she wish for? Rick asked, though his voice was gentler than the question. "Different things each year. Sometimes for good weather for the crops, sometimes for my father's cough to ease. The year before she died, I saw her lips moving when the first robin came, but she wouldn't tell me what she'd asked for." Maria's thumb traced the robin's wing. "I think she was already sick then, and she was wishing for more time." Rick studied her face in the flickering light, noting how her features had softened over the weeks. The sharp edges of constant fear had begun to blur, replaced by something more peaceful. She still startled at sudden sounds, still moved with careful economy, but there were moments now, like this one, when she seemed almost relaxed. "What would you wish for now?" he asked. "If you saw the first robin of spring?" The question hung between them, loaded with possibilities neither quite dared to voice. Maria was quiet for so long that Rick wondered if he'd overstepped, pushed too hard into territory she wasn't ready to explore. Finally, she looked directly at him, her dark eyes reflecting the firelight. "I think I'd wish for courage," she said softly. "The courage to believe that good things can happen to me, too." The admission hit Rick like a physical blow. That this remarkable woman, who had survived abuse, loss, and desperate flight, could still doubt her worthiness of happiness seemed almost unbearable. Yet he understood the sentiment. Hadn't he spent 7 years believing his capacity for joy had died with Anna? "You deserve good things, Maria," he said, his voice rough with conviction. "You deserve kindness and safety and—" He stopped, aware that he was approaching dangerous territory. "And what?" she asked, leaning forward slightly. Rick looked at her, really looked at her, taking in the gentle curve of her cheek, the intelligence in her eyes, the way the firelight caught the dark silk of her hair. When had she become so beautiful to him? When had her presence shifted from simply tolerated to actively treasured? "And love," he finished quietly. "You deserve to be loved." The words settled between them like a bridge neither had expected to build. Maria's breath caught, her hand tightening around the carved robin. In her eyes, Rick could see the same recognition he felt, that they had moved beyond simple companionship into something far more complex and fraught with possibility. "Rick," she said, his name barely a whisper. He reached across the space between their chairs, his fingers brushing hers where they held the wooden bird. The touch was electric, sending warmth up his arm and straight to his chest. Maria didn't pull away. Instead, she turned her hand palm up, allowing their fingers to intertwine. "I haven't felt this way since Anna," Rick admitted, his thumb tracing across her knuckles. "I didn't think I could, didn't think I should. I was never allowed to feel this way at all," Maria replied. "With Thomas, everything was about what I owed him, what I could provide. I don't know how to just be cared for." Rick brought their joined hands to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her fingers. "We'll figure it out together," he said. "No rushing, no pressure. Just this." Maria's eyes filled with tears, but they were different from the tears of grief she'd shed before. These spoke of overwhelming relief, of walls finally crumbling, of a heart daring to hope again. "I'm still married," she said, the words heavy with legal reality. "Technically, I'm still his wife. Not in any way that matters," Rick said firmly. "A piece of paper signed under duress doesn't make what he did to you acceptable. It doesn't make you belong to him. But if anyone found out, if he found out," Rick's hand tightened on hers. "He won't find you here. And if he does, he'll have to go through me first." The promise seemed to settle something in Maria's chest. She studied Rick's face, the weathered strength of it, the gentleness in his eyes that coexisted with unmistakable steel when it came to protecting what he cared about. "I think I'm falling in love with you," she whispered. The words carrying the weight of confession and fear and hope all tangled together. Rick's heart stopped, then began beating with a rhythm that felt entirely new. "I think I fell in love with you the morning I saw those bruises," he replied. "I just didn't want to admit it to myself." They sat there, hands joined, the carved robin warm between their palms, acknowledging the truth that had been building between them for weeks. Outside, the wind had calmed to barely a whisper, and inside, two damaged souls were discovering that healing didn't always require solitude. "What happens now?" Maria asked. Rick considered the question, thinking of spring still months away, of the isolation that protected them, of the careful steps they'd need to take to build something real and lasting from the fragile trust they'd established. "Now we take it one day at a time," he said. "We keep playing chess and sharing stories and learning to trust what's growing between us. And when spring comes—" He paused, struck by a vision of possibility he hadn't dared imagine before. "When spring comes, maybe we'll plant a garden together. Roses and delphiniums. And we'll watch for the first robin." Maria smiled, the expression transforming her entire face with radiant joy. "I'd like that very much." As they prepared for bed, both were aware that everything had changed. Rick found himself removing his wedding ring again, this time with deliberate intention. He held it for a moment, thinking of Anna, asking her silent permission to love again. In his heart, he felt her blessing, gentle and warm and free of jealousy. Maria clutched her carved robin as she prepared for sleep, marveling at how hope felt different from desperation. For so long, hope had been about escape, about survival, about making it through another day unharmed. Now hope felt like possibility, like gardens yet to be planted, like springs yet to come, like love that might actually be allowed to grow. In the quiet cabin, Two hearts that had thought themselves broken beyond repair were discovering that sometimes the most beautiful things grow in the spaces between what was lost and what might yet be found. The wanted poster lay folded in Rick's coat pocket like a coiled snake, its harsh black ink describing crimes that turned his blood cold. He'd gone to the trading post at Pine Ridge for winter supplies, his first trip to civilization in 2 months, expecting nothing more complicated than purchasing coffee, salt, and ammunition. Instead, he'd found himself staring at Maria's face sketched in rough charcoal lines, her name listed alongside that of her husband in connection with crimes that carried the death penalty. Wanted for murder and bank robbery, the poster proclaimed in bold letters. Thomas Garrett and Maria Garrett, suspected in the deaths of 3 men during the robbery of First National Bank, Denver, Colorado. $500 reward for information leading to capture. Considered armed and extremely dangerous. Rick had torn the poster from the post office wall with shaking hands, his mind reeling with implications that threatened to destroy everything he thought he knew about the woman he'd fallen in love with. The sketch was crude, but recognizable. Maria's delicate features rendered in harsh strokes, her hair pulled back severely, her eyes holding the same wariness he'd learned to read so well. Now, as his horse picked its way through the snow-laden pines toward home, Rick struggled with questions that had no comfortable answers. Was the woman sharing his cabin a cold-blooded killer? Had her story of abuse been an elaborate deception designed to secure shelter while she evaded justice? Or was she, as his heart insisted, an innocent woman caught in circumstances beyond her control? The evidence seemed damning. 3 men dead in a bank robbery, and Maria's name listed as an accomplice. But Rick had seen her gentle hands tend injured animals, had watched her weep over the memory of her lost daughter, had felt her tremble with genuine fear at his slightest harsh movement. Nothing about the woman he knew suggested capacity for violence, yet the poster was real, the crimes documented, the danger undeniable. If law enforcement was actively searching for Maria, then his mountain sanctuary wasn't safe at all. It was a trap waiting to spring shut on both of them. The cabin appeared through the snow-heavy trees like a vision from another life, smoke curling peacefully from its chimney, warm light glowing in the windows. Inside, Maria would be preparing their evening meal, probably humming quietly to herself as she moved through the familiar routines that had become so precious to him. In a few hours, they would sit by the fire, play chess, share stories, perhaps steal gentle kisses that tasted of promise and possibility. But first, he had to know the truth. Rick found Maria exactly where he'd expected, standing at the stove, stirring a pot of stew that filled the cabin with rich, comforting aromas. She looked up as he entered, her face lighting with the smile that had become his favorite sight in the world. "You're back earlier than I expected," she said, moving to help him with his coat. "The weather didn't turn bad, did it?" Rick allowed her to take his outer garments, acutely aware of the poster crackling in his coat pocket. Maria hung the coat on its usual peg, her movements graceful and domestic, completely at odds with the image of a dangerous fugitive. "Maria," he said carefully, "we need to talk." Something in his tone made her freeze, her hands stilling on the coat. When she turned to face him, the wary alertness he'd thought was fading had returned full force. "What's wrong?" she asked, and he could hear the fear creeping into her voice. Rick reached into his coat pocket and withdrew the folded poster, his hands steady despite the turmoil in his chest. "I found this at the trading post." Maria's face went white as fresh snow as she unfolded the paper. Her hands began to shake so violently that the poster rattled like leaves in a storm. For a long moment, she simply stared at the damning words, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. "Oh, God," she whispered. "Oh, God, he did it. He actually did it." The raw terror in her voice convinced Rick of her innocence more than any protestation could have. This wasn't the reaction of someone caught in a lie. This was the response of someone seeing her worst fears confirmed. "Tell me what happened," Rick said gently, guiding her to a chair before her trembling legs could give out. "All of it," Maria clutched the poster against her chest, tears streaming down her cheeks. The bank robbery. It was Thomas and two other men. I was there, but not by choice. Thomas said we were going to town for supplies, but when we got to Denver, he told me to wait in the bank while he conducted business. I thought it was something legal, her voice broke, and Rick knelt beside her chair, taking her free hand in both of his. Go on. I was sitting on the bench when Thomas and his men pulled out their guns. People started screaming and I tried to run, but Thomas grabbed me, said if I moved, he'd shoot me too. I had to watch. She squeezed her eyes shut. The bank clerk was just a boy, maybe 19. He tried to be brave, tried to protect the money, and Thomas shot him. Just like that. And then the bank president tried to stop them, and one of the other men killed him too. Rick felt sick imagining Maria trapped in that hellish scene, forced to witness murders she was powerless to prevent. The third man, he asked, a customer who tried to help. Thomas shot him in the back as he ran for the door. Maria's voice was barely above a whisper now. There was so much blood, and all I could do was sit there and watch because Thomas had his gun pointed at me the whole time. Why didn't you tell the authorities? When it was over, because Thomas told everyone I was his partner, Maria said, her voice hollow with despair. He'd planned it all along, brought me there to make it look like I was involved, to ensure my silence. He told me if I ever tried to leave him or betray him, he'd make sure everyone knew I was there, that I helped plan it. He said no one would believe I was innocent. The diabolical cleverness of it made Rick's stomach turn. Thomas had used the robbery not just to steal money, but to create an unbreakable chain around Maria's neck, ensuring her absolute compliance through the threat of being charged as an accomplice to murder. That's why you ran, Rick said, understanding flooding through him. When you heard he was wanted, I heard talk in the last town where we stayed. People saying the law was closing in, that there were wanted posters being distributed. I knew it was only a matter of time before they came for both of us. Maria looked at him with desperate eyes. I never fired a gun, never took a single dollar, never hurt anyone. But I was there, and that's enough to hang me. Rick pulled her into his arms, feeling her whole body shake with the terror of someone who had been living with this nightmare for months. We'll figure this out, he said fiercely. There has to be a way to prove your innocence. How? Maria asked, her voice muffled against his chest. Who would believe me? I'm the wife of a known killer, and I was in the bank when it happened. The law doesn't care about circumstances. They care about putting someone to blame on the gallows. Rick held her tighter, his mind racing through possibilities. The isolation that had seemed like perfect sanctuary now felt like a dead end. If law enforcement was actively searching for Maria, it was only a matter of time before they traced her movements to this area. And if they found her here, Rick would likely be charged as an accessory for harboring a fugitive. But looking down at Maria's tear-streaked face, at the woman who had brought light back into his dark world, Rick knew he didn't care about the risks to himself. Whatever it took to prove her innocence, whatever dangers they had to face, he would stand by her. We can't stay here, he said finally. If they're actively searching, they'll eventually work their way through all the mountain settlements. We need to move, find somewhere they won't think to look. Or, Maria said quietly, you could turn me in, collect the reward. Tell them I forced you to help me at gunpoint. The suggestion hit Rick like a slap. He pulled back to stare at her in disbelief. How can you even say that? Because I love you, Maria replied, fresh tears streaming down her cheeks. Because you have a life here, a home. Because I won't be responsible for destroying the peace you've built. Peace without you isn't peace at all, Rick said fiercely. It's just existence. And I'll be damned if I let you face this alone. Maria searched his face, looking for doubt or regret or the self-preservation that should have been urging him to cut his losses. Instead, she found only steady determination and love so fierce it took her breath away. What do we do? She whispered. Rick looked at the wanted poster, at the crude sketch that had transformed his beloved into a hunted criminal, and felt something cold and tactical settle in his chest, the part of him that had survived 4 years of war by thinking clearly under pressure. First, "We burn this," he said, taking the poster and tossing it into the fire. They watched the paper curl and blacken, Maria's sketched face disappearing into ash and flame. "Then we plan. If we're going to clear your name, we need to be smart about it. And if we're going to run, we need to be smarter." As the fire consumed the last traces of the wanted poster, Rick and Maria held each other close, both understanding that their peaceful winter sanctuary was about to become something far more dangerous. But they would face it together, and somehow, that made even the worst possibilities seem survivable. Outside, the wind was beginning to pick up again, and in the distance, the sound might have been another storm approaching, or it might have been the hoofbeats of men who had finally picked up their trail. The military discharge papers lay hidden beneath a loose floorboard in Rick's bedroom, wrapped in oiled cloth and forgotten by everyone except the man who had earned them through 4 years of blood and smoke. Maria discovered them by accident while helping him pack their most essential belongings, her foot catching on the slightly raised board as they prepared for what might be their final flight from the mountain sanctuary. "What's this?" she asked, kneeling to examine the loose plank. Rick looked up from the rifles he was cleaning and felt his stomach drop. In 7 years of solitary living, he'd never had reason to remember that hiding place, never needed to explain why a simple mountain trapper possessed documents that told a very different story about his past. "Just old papers," he said. But Maria was already working the board free with her fingertips. Revealing the carefully wrapped bundle beneath, she lifted the package with gentle curiosity, and Rick knew he couldn't stop her from seeing what lay inside. The oiled cloth fell away to reveal documents bearing official seals, commendations written in formal military language, and a photograph that made Maria's breath catch in her throat. The young man in the photograph wore a Union Army captain's uniform, his shoulders straight with the bearing of command, his eyes holding a hardness that the Rick she knew had learned to soften. But the face was unmistakably his, younger, leaner, marked by war in ways that peace had since healed. Captain Richard Thornfield. Maria read from the discharge papers, her voice filled with wonder. 4th Colorado Volunteer Infantry, commended for exceptional valor in the battles of Glorieta Pass and Picacho Peak. Noted for tactical brilliance in asymmetric warfare against Confederate and irregular forces. Rick sat back on his heels, watching her absorb this new understanding of who he had been before Anna, before the mountain, before the careful construction of a simple trapper's life. "You were a war hero," Maria said, looking up at him with something approaching awe. "I was a soldier," Rick corrected. "Heroes are what people call soldiers after the dying is done and everyone wants to forget the details." But Maria was studying the commendations more carefully, her intelligence picking up on details that told a larger story. Guerrilla tactics, reconnaissance and sabotage, training of irregular units. She looked at him with new understanding. "You weren't just any soldier. You were special forces," Rick nodded reluctantly. When the war came to Colorado Territory, they needed men who understood mountain fighting, who could move unseen and strike without warning. I'd grown up in these mountains, knew every trail and hiding place. Made me useful for certain kinds of work. "What kinds of work?" Maria asked, though her tone suggested she was beginning to guess. "The kind where you slip behind enemy lines and make their lives difficult. Destroy supply wagons, gather intelligence, train locals to fight the kind of war that makes conventional armies nervous." Rick's voice grew distant with memory. "I spent 2 years teaching farmers and shopkeepers how to become ghosts, how to appear from nowhere, strike hard and vanish before the enemy knew what hit them." Maria set the papers down carefully, pieces of a larger puzzle falling into place in her mind. "That's why you chose this location for your cabin. Not just for isolation, but for defensibility." Rick looked around the cabin with new eyes, seeing it as Maria now did, not just a retreat from the world, but a fortress designed by someone who understood warfare at its most fundamental level. The thick log walls that could stop rifle bullets, the narrow windows positioned for maximum visibility and defense, The multiple escape routes he'd carved through the surrounding forest. The cache of weapons and ammunition hidden in the root cellar. Old habits, he said simply. And that's how you knew, Maria continued, her voice growing excited as understanding dawned. About my story, about Thomas being dangerous. You recognized the tactics, didn't you? Using me as leverage, making me complicit in his crimes. It's the same principle as taking hostages to ensure cooperation. Rick nodded, impressed by her quick grasp of strategic thinking. Men like your husband understand power, and they use it the way armies do, through fear, control, and making resistance seem impossible. But what they don't always understand is that even the best strategic position can be turned against you if someone thinks it through carefully. Enough! Maria's eyes lit up with something Rick had never seen before, not just hope, but the fierce intelligence of someone who had found a puzzle she might actually be able to solve. You have a plan, she said. It wasn't a question. I'm working on one. But Maria, it's dangerous. More dangerous than running, more dangerous than hiding. If we do this wrong, we'll both end up dead or worse. Tell me. Rick spread a hand-drawn map across the table, showing trails and settlements throughout the Colorado Territory. I've been thinking about what you told me. Thomas using you as an unwilling witness, making sure you were present during the robbery to implicate you. That kind of calculation suggests he's done this before, probably multiple times. Maria nodded, following his reasoning. He was too confident, too prepared. He knew exactly how to position me, what to tell people afterward. Which means there might be other witnesses, other people who've seen his methods. And if we can find them, if we can build a pattern of behavior that shows his habit of using innocent people as shields, we might be able to prove I was coerced rather than complicit. Maria finished. But how do we find these other witnesses without exposing ourselves to capture? Rick pointed to several marked locations on his map. Before the war, I had contacts throughout the territory, men I served with, people who trusted me. One of them is a federal marshal now stationed in Denver, James Morrison. If anyone would be willing to listen to evidence about Thomas Garrett's methods, it would be him. You'd trust him with our lives. I'd trust him with my life, Rick said carefully. The question is whether you're willing to trust him with yours. Maria was quiet for a long moment, studying the map and the documents that revealed Rick's hidden past. What would this plan involve exactly? You'd write out a detailed account of everything, the coercion, the threats, every detail you can remember about how Thomas operated. I'd get that testimony to Morrison, along with information about Thomas's likely whereabouts and methods. If we're lucky, Morrison can use it to build a case that separates you from Thomas's crimes. And if we're unlucky, Rick met her eyes directly. If we're unlucky, we've given the law everything they need to convict you, and I've identified myself as an accomplice. We'd be completely at their mercy. The weight of the gamble settled between them like a physical presence. Everything they'd built together, all the trust and love and hope for a shared future, would be wagered on the integrity of a man Maria had never met, and the possibility that justice still existed in a world that had shown her little of it. There's another option, Rick said quietly. We run. Tonight. I know places deeper in the mountains where no law has ever penetrated, places where we could disappear completely. We'd never be able to return to civilization, never have the life we've talked about. But we'd be together, and we'd be safe. Maria looked around the cabin that had become home, at the chess set where they'd learned to trust each other, at the fireplace where they'd shared their deepest pains and tentative hopes. Then she looked at Rick, this man who had revealed himself to be so much more than he'd seemed, who was offering to sacrifice everything for her safety. What do you think we should do? She asked. I think, Rick said slowly, that you deserve better than a life spent running. I think you deserve to have your name cleared, to walk freely in the world without fear. And I think if there's any chance of that happening, we have to take it. Maria nodded, a fierce determination settling over her features. Then we fight. We take the risk, and we fight for the chance to have a real future together. Rick felt something settle in his chest, the familiar calm that came before action. the mental clarity that had served him through countless dangerous missions. "Then we'd better get started. Dawn is still hours away, and we have a lot of work to do." They spent the remaining hours of darkness preparing for what might be their last stand. Maria wrote her testimony in careful detail, documenting every aspect of Thomas's coercion and manipulation. Rick cleaned his weapons and planned routes to Denver, calculating travel times and identifying safe places to rest. They packed supplies for a journey that might end in vindication or death, but which represented their only chance at a life together built on truth rather than concealment. As the first pale light of dawn touched the mountain peaks, Rick and Maria stood at the cabin door, looking back at the refuge that had sheltered their growing love through the darkest months of winter. They were about to trade safety for the possibility of freedom, solitude, for the chance at a shared future that didn't require them to live in the shadows. "Ready?" Rick asked, shouldering his pack and checking his rifle one final time. Maria touched the carved wooden robin in her pocket, thinking of her mother's wishes for spring's promise, then looked at the man who had taught her that love didn't have to hurt. "Ready," she said, and stepped out into the dawn of their most dangerous gamble yet. The loaded rifle rested against the cabin wall like a sleeping predator, its polished barrel catching the first light of dawn. Rick had positioned it there before going to bed, along with his old army Colt and enough ammunition to hold off a small army. Now, as hoofbeats echoed through the mountain morning, he understood that his preparations hadn't been paranoid. They'd been prophetic. 3 riders emerged from the tree line, moving with the confident swagger of men who believed they held all the advantages. Rick recognized Thomas Garrett immediately from Maria's descriptions. A big man with cold eyes and the kind of face that had learned to smile while planning cruelty. The 2 men flanking him looked like hired guns, the kind of men who sold their skill with weapons to anyone willing to pay their price. "Maria!" Thomas's voice boomed across the clearing, carrying the false heartiness of a man performing for an audience. "Come out, darling. Your husband's come to take you home." Rick felt Maria's hand grip his arm where they crouched by the window, watching the riders position themselves in a rough semicircle around the cabin. Her face had gone pale as winter snow, but her jaw was set with determination he'd never seen before. "He found us," she whispered, stating the obvious, because sometimes terror needed to be given words. "Yes, but we're not helpless," Rick replied, checking his rifle's load one final time. "Remember what we discussed. If shooting starts, you get to the root cellar and stay there until it's over. I'm not leaving you to face this alone. You're not leaving me," Rick said firmly. "You're giving me one less thing to worry about so I can focus on keeping us both alive," Thomas called out again, his voice carrying the edge of impatience. "I know you're in there, Maria. You and whatever mountain man you've been keeping company with. Come out now, and maybe we can discuss this like civilized people." Rick almost laughed at the irony. Civilized people didn't travel in armed groups to reclaim women who'd fled their violence. Civilized people didn't leave trails of bodies behind bank robberies. But Thomas was playing to an audience of his hired men, maintaining the fiction that this was a domestic dispute rather than a manhunt. "What do you want, Thomas?" Rick called back, making his voice carry without showing himself at the window. Military training had taught him the value of controlling information. Never let your enemy see your exact position until you're ready to use it. "Just want my wife back," Thomas replied. And Rick could hear the false reasonableness in his tone. "She's confused, probably scared. Been filling her head with lies about me, I'd guess. But that's between Maria and me. You can walk away from this with no trouble at all. And if I don't..." The mask slipped for just a moment, revealing the cold calculation beneath Thomas's performed civility. "Then you'll learn why 3 banks in Colorado Territory decided my business wasn't worth the risk." Rick understood the threat perfectly. Thomas was telling him, and his hired guns, that this mountain trapper was just another obstacle to be removed, no different from bank clerks who'd tried to be heroes. But Thomas had made a critical error in his assessment of the situation. He was thinking like a bully used to intimidating ordinary citizens. Not like a soldier facing someone who'd survived 4 years of war. Maria's not going anywhere with you, Rick said, shifting position to gain a better angle on the riders. She's made her choice. Maria doesn't get to make choices, Thomas snapped, his control slipping further. She's my wife, my property, and she's coming home to answer for running off like some common, I'm not your property. Maria's voice rang out clear and strong, cutting through Thomas's words like a blade. I never was, Rick cursed under his breath. They'd agreed she would stay hidden, but he understood the impulse. After months of living in fear of this man, she needed to speak her own truth, claim her own voice in the confrontation that would determine her fate. Thomas's laugh was ugly and triumphant. There's my girl. Knew you couldn't hide forever. Now come out here so we can go home and forget this whole foolish adventure. I've seen the wanted posters, Thomas, Maria called back, and Rick heard the steel in her voice that he'd come to admire. I know what you did, what you made me part of. I won't be your shield anymore. The silence that followed stretched taut as a bowstring. Rick could almost hear Thomas recalculating, realizing that his carefully constructed leverage had been discovered and neutralized. A cornered animal was always most dangerous, and Thomas Garrett had just been cornered. You stupid woman, Thomas finally said, all pretense of civility abandoned. You think anyone's going to believe you were innocent? You were there, you saw everything, and you kept quiet for months afterward. That makes you guilty as sin in the eyes of the law. Maybe, Maria replied. But that's for a judge to decide, not you. Rick smiled grimly at her response. She was forcing Thomas to show his true colors, making it clear to his hired men that this wasn't a domestic dispute, but a criminal operation trying to eliminate a witness. Smart tactics and exactly what he would have done in her position. Boys, Thomas said to his companions, his voice dropping to businesslike tones. Seems we've got ourselves a situation that needs resolving. The woman's gone loco, and her friend here doesn't understand how things work in the real world. One of the hired guns, a lean man with the kind of mustache that suggested he thought himself a gentleman, cleared his throat. This is starting to sound less like retrieving a wayward wife and more like silencing witnesses, Garrett. Rick felt a flicker of hope. Internal dissension among his enemies was always an advantage to be exploited. The woman's my wife, Thomas said firmly. Oh, what happens between us is legal and proper. As for the trapper, well, he's harboring a known fugitive. That makes him fair game. Known fugitive according to who? The second hired gun asked. This one was younger, with the nervous energy of someone still learning to live with violence. You said the law was looking for both of you, not just her. Thomas's control was unraveling faster now, his carefully constructed fiction crumbling under questions he hadn't expected to field. The details don't matter. What matters is that woman belongs to me, and I'm taking her home. Rick chose that moment to show himself, stepping into the doorway with his rifle held casually but ready. Here's the thing, Thomas. She doesn't want to go home with you. And where I come from, that's the end of the discussion. Thomas stared at him, taking in the confident bearing, the easy way Rick held his weapon, the complete absence of fear in his demeanor. For the first time, Rick saw uncertainty flicker in the other man's eyes. You have any idea who you're dealing with, Mountain Man? I know exactly who I'm dealing with, Rick replied. A coward who beats women and uses them as human shields during his crimes. A man so weak, he has to hire guns to face one retired soldier in his own home. The insult hit its mark. Thomas's face flushed with rage, his hand moving toward his sidearm. Retired soldier, Captain Richard Thornfield, 4th Colorado Volunteer Infantry, Rick said evenly. You might have heard stories about what we did to Confederate supply lines in these mountains. Same principles apply to bank robbers who threaten innocent women. The lean gunman with the mustache was suddenly looking very thoughtful, studying Rick with new respect. Thornfield? I heard that name during the war. You were the ghost the Confederates couldn't catch. Reputation gets exaggerated over time, Rick said modestly. But I did learn a few things about mountain fighting that might be relevant to our current situation. Thomas was beginning to understand that his simple plan to retrieve his runaway wife had become something far more complex and dangerous. But he'd committed too much to back down now, invested too much of his authority in front of his hired men to appear weak. "I don't care if you're Ulysses S. Grant himself," Thomas snarled, finally drawing his pistol. "That woman is coming with me, and you're not going to stop me." The moment the gun cleared Thomas's holster, everything changed. Rick dove sideways, his rifle swinging up to track his primary target. The lean gunman was already moving, his professional instincts taking over as the situation exploded into violence. The younger hired gun hesitated, caught between self-preservation and whatever loyalty his pay had purchased. The first shot came from Thomas's pistol, the bullet splintering wood where Rick had been standing a moment before. Rick's return fire was more accurate, catching Thomas in the shoulder and spinning him from his saddle. The wounded man hit the ground hard, his gun flying from his grasp. The lean gunman had his weapon out now, searching for a clean shot at Rick while his horse danced nervously beneath him. "This wasn't part of the deal, Garrett," he shouted. "You said this would be simple." "Kill him!" Thomas screamed from where he lay clutching his wounded shoulder. "Kill them both!" But Rick was already moving again, using every piece of cover the cabin's surroundings provided, making himself a difficult target while keeping his rifle trained on the remaining threats. This was the kind of fighting he understood: close quarters, limited visibility, where experience and tactical thinking mattered more than raw firepower. The battle for Maria's freedom had begun in earnest, and Rick intended to end it on his terms. The letter lay folded in Maria's trembling hands, 3 pages of careful testimony that contained either their salvation or their death warrant. She had written every word in her own hand, documented every detail of Thomas's coercion and the bank robbery that had shattered her life. Now, as gunfire exploded around the cabin, that letter represented the only thing standing between her and the gallows. Maria pressed herself against the cabin wall, trying to follow Rick's instructions to stay hidden while her heart hammered against her ribs. Through the window she could see Thomas, struggling to rise from where Rick's shot had dropped him, blood staining his shirt, but fury keeping him upright. The lean gunman was circling the cabin on horseback, looking for a better angle, while the younger hired gun seemed frozen with indecision. "Maria!" Thomas roared, his voice hoarse with pain and rage. "You come out here right now, or I'll burn this whole place down around you." She closed her eyes, feeling the weight of choice settling on her shoulders. Rick was outnumbered and taking fire from multiple directions. His military training gave him advantages, but even the best soldier could be overwhelmed by superior numbers and firepower. If she stayed hidden as he'd demanded, she'd be safe until the shooting stopped. But what if Rick didn't survive? What if her cowardice cost him his life? The sound of splintering wood made her decision for her. One of the gunmen had put a bullet through the cabin's front wall, close enough to Rick's position that she heard him curse. Time was running out, and Maria realized she had something Thomas wanted more than Rick's death: herself and the testimony that could destroy him. "Thomas," she called out, rising to show herself in the doorway. "Stop shooting! I'll come with you." "Maria, no!" Rick's voice cracked with desperate authority, but she was already stepping outside. The folded testimony clutched against her chest like armor. Thomas straightened at the sight of her, triumph flickering in his eyes despite his wounded shoulder. "Now you're showing some sense. Come here, darling. Time to go home and forget this whole mess." But Maria didn't move toward him. Instead, she held up the folded papers where all 3 men could see them. "Do you know what this is, Thomas?" His eyes narrowed, some instinct warning him that his wife had become something he didn't recognize. "Some foolishness you've been scribbling, I'd guess." "It's my testimony," Maria said, her voice carrying clearly across the clearing. "Every detail about the bank robbery in Denver. How you forced me to be there. How you used me as a shield while you murdered 3 innocent men. How you threatened to frame me if I ever tried to leave." The lean gunman's horse shied as his attention snapped fully to Maria. "She was a witness to the Denver job?" "She was my accomplice," Thomas said quickly, but there was desperation creeping into his voice now. "No," Maria said firmly. "I was your hostage, And I've written down every word you said, every threat you made, every detail about how you planned to use my presence to ensure my silence." She looked directly at the hired guns. "Did he tell you he was wanted for murder? Did he mention that killing me and Rick would make you accessories to murder as well as bank robbery?" The younger gunman was already lowering his weapon, his face pale with the realization of what he'd walked into. "This ain't what you told us, Garrett. You said it was a domestic matter." "It is a domestic matter," Thomas snarled, but his authority over his men was crumbling visibly. "She's my wife. She's a witness to murder," the lean gunman interrupted, his professional instincts finally overriding his loyalty to Thomas's money. "And we're about to become witnesses too, or worse." That was the moment Rick had been waiting for, the moment when Thomas's support collapsed and he became truly isolated. Rick stepped out of cover, his rifle trained on Thomas, but his voice directed to the hired guns. "Gentlemen, you have about 10 seconds to decide whether you're going to die for this man's crimes or ride away and pretend you were never here." The younger gunman was already wheeling his horse away from the confrontation. "I didn't sign up for murder, Garrett. Find yourself some other fool." The lean gunman hesitated a moment longer, clearly calculating odds and loyalties. Then he tipped his hat to Maria with something approaching respect. "Ma'am, I hope that testimony of yours finds its way to the right people." With that, he spurred his horse after his companion, leaving Thomas alone and wounded in the clearing. Thomas stared after his departing allies with an expression of pure disbelief, as if he couldn't comprehend how his careful plans had unraveled so completely. When he turned back to face Rick and Maria, his eyes held the kind of desperate fury that made cornered animals deadly. "You think this changes anything?" he asked, his voice rough with pain and rage. "You think anyone's going to believe your word against mine? I'm still your husband, Maria. That still means something in civilized society." "Not anymore," Maria replied, and pulled a second folded document from her dress pocket. "This is a letter from Federal Marshal James Morrison, confirming that my testimony has been received and that a warrant for your arrest has been issued. Rick got word to him 3 days ago. The lie came easily, born of desperate necessity and the hope that confidence could substitute for truth." Thomas couldn't know they'd never actually contacted Morrison. Couldn't know the letter was actually one of Anna's old recipes that Maria had folded to look official. Thomas stared at the supposed letter with growing horror. "That's impossible. We've been watching you. You've been watching the cabin," Rick said, understanding Maria's gambit and supporting it. "But these mountains have more trails than you know about. I've been coming and going without you seeing me for days." For the first time since arriving, Thomas looked genuinely afraid. The prospect of federal marshals on his trail, of his crimes being documented and distributed to law enforcement across the territory, clearly terrified him more than any physical threat. "You're bluffing," he said. But his voice lacked conviction. Maria stepped closer, close enough that Thomas could see the details of her supposed letter. "Marshal Morrison is very interested in your methods, Thomas, especially your habit of using innocent people as accomplices to ensure their silence. He thinks it shows a pattern of behavior that juries find very compelling." Thomas's hand moved toward the gun he'd dropped when Rick shot him, but Rick's rifle swung to track the movement. "I wouldn't," Rick advised quietly. "You're already wounded, outnumbered, and wanted by federal law enforcement. Don't make this worse for yourself." Thomas looked between Rick's steady rifle and Maria's determined face, seeing his world collapse around him. The woman who had been his victim and shield for so long had become his accuser, and the mountain man he dismissed as irrelevant had proven to be far more dangerous than anticipated. "This isn't over," Thomas said. But even he seemed to recognize the weakness of the threat. "Yes, it is," Maria replied with quiet finality. "Your power over me ended the moment I found the courage to speak the truth. Everything else is just details for the courts to decide." As if summoned by her words, the sound of approaching horses echoed through the mountain morning. Rick tensed, wondering if Thomas had more allies they hadn't accounted for. But Maria's face lit up with genuine hope. "That would be Marshal Morrison," she said. maintaining the fiction that had already served them so well. Right on time. Whether the approaching riders were actually federal marshals or simply other travelers, Thomas clearly wasn't willing to gamble his freedom on finding out. With a final look of pure hatred, he stumbled toward his horse, clutching his wounded shoulder. "This isn't over, Maria," he repeated as he hauled himself into the saddle. "A man's got rights to his wife, and no law can change that forever." But as he rode away, disappearing into the forest, like the coward he'd always been beneath his bluster, Maria felt something she hadn't experienced in years, the absolute certainty that she was finally, truly free. The testimony in her hands represented more than just evidence of Thomas's crimes. It was proof that she had found her voice, her courage, and her right to determine her own fate. Whatever came next, she would face it not as Thomas Garrett's victim, but as Maria, a woman who had learned that love didn't have to hurt, that safety was possible, and that some things were worth fighting for no matter the cost. The two simple gold wedding bands lay side by side on the altar of the small church in Pine Ridge, catching the spring sunlight that streamed through windows opened to let in the mountain air. Rick had purchased them from the town's only jeweler 3 days earlier, choosing rings that were sturdy rather than ornate, built to last through decades of shared work and love rather than merely to impress for a single ceremony. 6 months had passed since that terrible morning when Thomas Garrett had come hunting for Maria. 6 months during which the world had transformed around them in ways neither had dared to imagine. The approaching hoofbeats that had frightened Thomas into flight had indeed belonged to Marshal Morrison, who had arrived with a federal warrant based on testimony from other victims of Thomas's crimes. It seemed Maria hadn't been his only unwilling accomplice. Other women in other towns had suffered similar coercion, and their combined testimonies had built an unshakable case. Thomas himself had been captured attempting to cross into Mexico, his shoulder wound having slowed him just enough for the law to catch up. He now awaited trial in Denver, facing charges that would likely see him hang. The hired guns who had abandoned him had provided additional testimony in exchange for reduced sentences, their professional pride evidently wounded by having been deceived about the nature of their employment. Maria's legal troubles had evaporated like morning mist under the marshal's investigation. Not only had she been cleared of all charges related to the bank robbery, but she'd been commended for her courage in providing evidence that had helped solve several other crimes across the territory. The wanted posters bearing her likeness had been destroyed, replaced by official documents declaring her a valuable witness, deserving of protection rather than prosecution. The mountain cabin that had sheltered their growing love now served as their summer retreat, while their primary home had become a small ranch in the valley below Pine Ridge. Rick had used his savings to purchase the property, good land with water rights and enough pasture to support cattle and horses. It was close enough to town for Maria to practice her herbal healing arts among neighbors who had quickly learned to trust her gentle skills, but far enough away to provide the peace and space they both cherished. "Are you ready?" Rick asked, adjusting the collar of his best shirt. He'd grown nervous as the ceremony approached, not because he doubted his feelings for Maria, but because happiness still felt fragile to him, something that might disappear if he breathed too loudly. Maria smoothed the skirt of her new dress, pale blue silk that brought out the darkness of her eyes, purchased specially for this day from the dressmaker in the territorial capital. It was the first truly beautiful thing she'd owned in years, and wearing it made her feel like the woman she'd been before fear had taught her to make herself small and invisible. "I've been ready since that first evening we played chess," she replied, taking his arm as they approached the altar where Pastor Williams waited with a gentle smile. The congregation was small but meaningful. Marshal Morrison and his wife had made the journey from Denver. Several of Rick's old Army colleagues had come to witness their captain's second chance at happiness, and most of the residents of Pine Ridge had turned out to support the couple who had become such valued members of their community. Maria's skill with healing herbs had already saved 2 children from serious illness, while Rick's knowledge of mountain survival had helped several families prepare for the harsh winter months. Pastor Williams opened his worn Bible and began the familiar words that had joined countless couples throughout the territory. But for Rick and Maria, the ceremony felt entirely unique, entirely theirs. A public declaration of private promises they'd already made to each other during the dark winter months when survival had depended on trust. Do you, Richard, take Maria to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, for as long as you both shall live? Rick looked into Maria's eyes, seeing there the courage that had enabled her to rebuild her life from ashes, the gentleness that had healed his wounded heart, the strength that had carried her through unimaginable trials. "I do," he said, his voice steady with absolute certainty. "Do you, Maria, take Richard to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, for as long as you both shall live?" Maria thought of the journey that had brought her to this moment, the fear and pain of her first marriage, the desperate flight that had led her to Rick's mountain sanctuary, the slow healing that had taught her what love actually looked like when it wasn't twisted by possession and control. "I do," she said, her voice clear and strong. The rings slipped easily onto their fingers, simple gold bands that symbolized the uncomplicated truth of their commitment to each other. When Pastor Williams pronounced them husband and wife, their kiss was gentle and reverent, a promise sealed before God and community. The celebration that followed was warm with genuine affection. Marshal Morrison raised a toast to justice served and love rewarded. Rick's old army friends shared stories of their captain's wartime heroism that made Maria understand even more deeply the man she'd married. The townspeople of Pine Ridge welcomed Maria officially into their community, several women already discussing plans to learn her healing techniques. But the moment that touched Maria most deeply came when Mrs. Henderson, the town's oldest resident, approached with a small wrapped package. Inside was a tiny pair of knitted booties, soft blue wool worked with careful stitches. "For when the time comes, dear," the elderly woman said with a knowing smile. "These mountains could use more children, and you two will make wonderful parents." Maria's hand moved instinctively to her stomach, where the earliest signs of new life were just beginning to make themselves known. She and Rick had discovered her pregnancy only a week ago, the fulfillment of dreams they'd both thought lost forever. The baby wouldn't arrive until late autumn, but already they'd begun planning, expanding the ranch house, preparing a nursery, dreaming of names that honored both their pasts and their hopes for the future. "Thank you," Maria whispered, tears of pure joy streaming down her cheeks. "Thank you so much." As the sun set behind the mountains, Rick and Maria stood together on the porch of their new home, watching the first stars appear in the clear sky. The carved wooden robin that had become Maria's talisman sat on the windowsill nearby, and somewhere in the distance, the call of real robins announced that spring had truly arrived in the high country. "Any regrets?" Rick asked, his arm around his wife's waist. Maria leaned into his warmth, thinking of the long path that had led them to this moment of perfect peace. "Only that it took me so long to find my way to you," she replied. "But maybe we both needed to be broken before we could learn how to heal each other." Rick pressed a kiss to the top of her head, breathing in the scent of the wildflowers she'd woven into her hair for the wedding. "Anna used to say that God's timing was always perfect, even when we couldn't see the plan. I think she would have liked you very much." "I hope so. I hope she knows we're happy." Above them, the first robin of true spring called out from the old oak tree beside their house, its song clear and sweet in the mountain air. Maria smiled, remembering her mother's belief that robins carried messages of hope, promises that winter's hardships would give way to seasons of growth and renewal. "Make a wish," Rick murmured, remembering the tradition she'd shared with him during those long winter evenings by the fire. Maria closed her eyes, one hand resting on her still, flat belly where new life was growing, the other intertwined with her husband's weathered fingers. Her wish was simple and profound, for the child they'd created together to know only love and safety. For their family to grow strong in this mountain sanctuary they'd built from the ruins of their separate griefs. And for time enough to prove that some stories, no matter how dark they begin, can still find their way to endings filled with light. When she opened her eyes, Rick was watching her with an expression of such complete contentment that it took her breath away. This man who had learned to love again after loss, who had fought for her freedom and offered her a future built on respect rather than fear. This man was her husband now, and she was his wife, and their story was just beginning. The robin called out once more. It sung a benediction over their new beginning, and then flew off into the gathering dusk, carrying their hopes on swift wings toward whatever adventures tomorrow might bring to the small ranch in the valley where two wounded hearts had learned, against all odds, how to heal.